Hello, Billy here. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about how my use of generative AI has changed since the fall of 2024 and how I use it today in the summer of 2026. So it really has changed a lot since I started using generative AI at a really integral part of my workflow. But before we get to how I was using it originally in 2024, I want to talk a little bit about how I did projects prior to 2024, the fall of 2024. So prior to really using generative AI in a big way, when I had a task to do, let's say I would start by receiving that task, clarifying the needs, the desired outcome for that task, and then I would go about trying to write out the code or write out the document to achieve the completion of that task. And then I would look things up if I had questions, whether it be doing a Google search, looking on Stack Overflow, looking at old projects that I've done to see if there is something similar that I could reuse to help achieve some kind of goal. But that was a long process and it would take time to do all of that. In fall of 2024, how I would use generative AI to help me with certain tasks is I would essentially start out a very simple ideas saying, let's say I wanted to create an example problem with a solution for students in a class. I would say I would like to do a problem that is asking students to do X, Y, or Z, then provide a line-by-line explanation for that problem. So then it would provide that output, it would provide a question, and then it would provide a solution, and then it would provide the line-by-line explanation. So it would provide some kind of output, or its best attempt at an output. But then I would have to take that, put it in a document, and correct all of the mistakes, because it would make a lot of mistakes. That was one example. Another example is basically when I have to write a performance review, a self-evaluation. What I actually do is every week I update a document where I just write down briefly in notes what I did for that week, and I just categorize it by year and then month. So if I met with students to mentor them for next steps for graduate school or getting a job, I write that I did that. If I met with instructors to supervise them in the transition from not teaching a course to teaching a course, I would write that down. If I taught that month, I would write that down. So anything I did, doesn't have to be super detailed, but anything that I did, I would write it down so that it's just in a bullet point list. And then what I would do to help me create the document for a self-evaluation, I would first give it the self-evaluation document, tell it to summarize that document to me. If it summarized it well, I would then say, here's everything that I did in the past year. Write me my report, my self-evaluation report based on what I have done for the past year. And then it would attempt to fill in all of the information as needed. And so that would just reduce the amount of burden that I would need to do in a significant way. I would still have to go through and check everything because it would make mistakes. But instead of needing to come up with the verbiage for everything, instead I'm just editing. And for me at least, that's a much easier process than writing it from scratch. So at least for me, the hardest part about writing has always been the getting something onto the page. Editing and revising is much easier for me. And so that process of getting something on the page was a huge help, exceedingly helpful. There are other writers where that's not helpful. They actually find the revision and editing process not as helpful. So that particular solution might not work for everyone. But at least for me, it was a huge time saver. That is how I would basically start in fall of 2026 with how I use generative AI. But now, I still use some of that, but it's a lot different. So now I use a tool called Claude Code. I'm not sponsored by them. They didn't ask me to talk about Claude Code. I just use it, and I really like the product. But I'm not married to it in the sense that if a better tool comes along, I'm happy to use that. But essentially, what Claude Code does is that you give it access to your files for a particular project, and then you give it a prompt to say what you would like done. And what it does is one of the tools is that it creates a plan. So then you can view the plan and then provide suggestions on what you would like changed. And then once you approve the plan, it tries to do the said task, and then I evaluate how well it did. And if it did a great job, great. Maybe I need to make some small edits, but it's pretty much ready to go. But often what happens is then I say, okay, great, you did step 1, but now we need to do step 2, where we change some things. Maybe we missed the model calibration here, etc. So we need to change some parts of the code. And then I would go in and provide it that feedback. It would create a new plan. I evaluate the plan. I tell changes that need to happen in the plan, and it's a constant back and forth. And so it's more, an example where it's similar prior to generative AI is if you are mentoring someone and you're trying to train them to do a task, it's a collaborative process in my opinion, where you tell them to do the task, you give them general guidance, but you should still expect to have to provide feedback to that person as they're doing it. Like, just give them slight nudges as they're painting a fence. It's not just paint the fence and go to it. You have to evaluate them and train them and watch them do it and give them critiques as they paint the fence. Like, you can't just lob on blobs of paint onto the fence. You have to do a light coating so that it's an even coating throughout, and so it looks much more appealing as you're painting the fence over a long period of time. Using tools like Claude Code make the generative AI process much more collaborative and much more powerful because you can get a lot more done. So once you approve the plan from Claude Code, that frees you up to do other things. So for example, maybe I will approve a plan and then I will go to a meeting, or I will go teach a class, or I will go do my laundry. Just whatever I need to get done, I can have Claude Code do a lot of the tedious components that would require me to sit down prior to generative AI and do it all. And then it will do it. It will revise things as it makes mistakes. And then I can go do things that only I can do, like go in front of a class and teach. And so there are certain things where Claude Code, maybe it would be more efficient to have a human sit down and just do the thing. But the fact that you can offload some of these tasks to generative AI, you then do what you have to do that only you can do, improves your ability to get things done in a much more meaningful manner. And so that is the very basic idea of how I utilize generative AI in a meaningful way, and how it's really changed since 2024. Because now it's just a very different way, and it's just so much more productive than even how I used to do things in 2024 relative to now in 2026. And so I'm interested to see how things change down the line and how the productivity gains can be increased as these tools become more accessible and more available to lots of different folks.